So excuse whatever this is going on. So yeah, as Shay so very gushingly said, I'm Elise Bernard. I work with the Organization for Prostitution Survivors in Seattle. We run a little bit of a different organization. We are primarily a direct service organization. However, we also do community education, and we also do advocacy work, and a little bit of men's demand, men's accountability, demand reduction, that sort of thing. If you were in the plenary yesterday, you know that we're also a part of the Ending Exploitation Collaborative, which is our primary demand reduction team in Seattle working against demand to reduce it. That's a team of 3 nonprofits, the Attorney General's Office, the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office, and Seattle City Attorney's Office. So pretty cool. We, again, like I said, we run a little bit of a different organization. Instead of doing your typical, executive director up at the top with a board above them and staff and this massive hierarchy of insanity, we actually decided to flatten that out a little bit. So the top level of our organization is actually run by 3 directors. So we have Angeli Dodge, myself, and my co-director, Noel Gomez. And one of the coolest things about this is that 2 of us are survivors, and Angeli is the daughter of a survivor. So we have a multi-generational lens on this problem that is really, really, really unique. And it gives us an ability to serve women in a way that I want to say I haven't really seen done before. And I'm extremely proud and honored to be a part of that. I'm going to sip a little bit more coffee. In the meantime, I'm going to hand this over to my wonderful co-director, Angeli Dodge, who is our Director of Operations and has done some amazing work in the trauma-informed care setting. And she is working to bring that trauma-informed lens to our human resources, to our policies, to our processes and procedures. This is truly a survivor-centered way of doing things. And before I go sip coffee, I'll say one thing about that. I actually don't like the terminology survivor leadership, because I don't actually think any one of us should be leading this movement. I believe we should be centering on survivors. I believe we should be breaking down those hierarchies. When we say leadership, we generally mean one person out in front of the other. And truthfully, in this movement, survivor leadership doesn't mean that. It means survivor consulted. It means you have a token survivor on your board, or you have a token survivor on a task force, and that person isn't so much leading the table as they are just at the table and getting a stipend and then going home. We want to change that. We want to change that to a movement where we are breaking down those barriers in between survivors and survivors, survivors and allies, and allies and allies, and simply, quite honestly, being mostly women in this movement doing the work together. So with that, I'm going to give this off to Angeli and take some more caffeine.
Hi, everybody. I'm Angeli Dodge. I'm also sick. So if you can't understand me, say something. Because my voice is weird. But I, like Elisa said, so I'm the director at Ops. But before that, I spent most of my career in social services. So I ran a homeless shelter for under 18 youth for about a year. And when I was there, what we did was we started the program from the ground up, and we really wanted to look at how we really changed the model of care for our youth, for runaway and homeless youth, for sexually exploited youth. We had beds set aside for this, for sexually exploited youth coming through the foster care system. And what we knew is that the traditional system of care in our shelters and in our social service agencies is not working for them. And kids, especially girls of color, boys of color, are blowing out of the programs, and it's just churning and burning, and we're just adding to this system that is so broken. And so really wanting to go forward and say, how do we break down these barriers to really create a safe and restorative and healing place for kids who have seen some of the world's most horrific abuses, both systemically and individually. So this is, I decided to kind of do some work on what trauma looks like when it's embedded in organizations. And it turns out there's a body of literature and work and research on that, on how you actually create trauma in programs and maintain that trauma in social service programs because of the way we're doing things. So today we're going to go through how trauma behaviors and participants really impact the organization. And if an organization isn't structured in a way that's really breaking down these barriers, breaking down hierarchy, addressing systemic oppression, then we're not going to really be able to tackle these issues. We have to go to the root. We're going to be talking about, like Elisa was talking about, shifting those power dynamics. This isn't going to work if there's hierarchy. It's just not. And what I've seen is a stripping of emotion, of heart, of love, of care from our social service programs in the name of boundaries, in the name of professionalism. And what that does is it disconnects us as humans. And that is not what brings about healing and growth and liberation. And so we're going to talk about how we can really shift that intentionally. And then I'm going to talk about how hard it is. It's not easy. This is not easy. Trauma's not warm and fuzzy. This is hard work, and it's not only hard work for the participants, for the women, for the survivors in our programs. It's hard work for adults. It's hard work for allies. And if we are expecting anyone to come up against these systems, we have to embrace that ourselves and be willing to do the adult self-work that comes along with that. I'm going to talk about the program container and really embedding, again, survivor and participant voice into the program structure at every level of an organization. Okay, so I kind of said all that. So we know that trauma is really central to our work, right? Every single, if you're working in policy, if you're working in direct service, no matter where you're at, the folks who we're coming in contact with have extreme, intense, historical, generational, interpersonal trauma that they've experienced. And what I've seen in programming is that the script is to manage, control, consequence, react. We're dealing with this. When conflict arises in programs, when kids, teens act the way kids and teens act, actually, they're being punished and they're really being harmed. And so we want to really switch that script. We want to talk about how we can set up every program, every agency to focus on recovery, prevention, healing, skill building, resourcing, and empowering and liberating. And really focusing on that instead of focusing on how we're going to deal with, how we're going to tackle this in a way that's really problem focused instead of solution focused. It's weakness focused instead of strength focused. It's victim, right? So we're really shifting it to honor, because we know that survivors, they're powerful. They're most powerful folks on this planet. We need to learn from them. And so this is breaking down, I've seen in social service agencies, this huge power yuckiness between staff and agencies. So when we start to look at trauma and violence and how that's impacting all of us, we know, so this is probably a review, but the impacts of trauma on the brain, right? It's big. So what happens is that when trauma happens to the brain, it really messes up the neural pathways in our brain. And so there's some stuff on the next page about the brain, but what happens is that folks, often you see in their teen years or in adult years, this opposition to authority, right? Because of power, again, because power has been stripped from them. And so what you get is this wanting to exert power in the ways that they can, right? An loss of emotional management and regulation, and so we see the not being able to make decisions clearly, not being able to have a lot of judgment because trauma is really leading. Problems with cognition, inability to communicate effectively, so an ability to really voice what they're feeling and name those feelings, so all of that, and a confused sense of fair play. And so thinking that things aren't going them because they're not, right? And so we have to look at how systems, again, these are the most marginalized folks that are coming through. Survivors are layered on with systems of oppression. So how can we really intercept that? So there's different types of violence. So we know the different types of violence that are out there. There's self-directed violence. So this is the violence against yourself, right? So this is me beating myself up, saying I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy. I'm not, why am I up here talking right now, right? Like, these are all the things that we tell ourselves to beat ourselves up because the world gives us this template that says, you're not good enough, you're not worthy enough. And this is what every youth has in them too, right? You're with all of our systems, right? I'm not rich enough, I'm not, all these things. There's the interpersonal trauma, so we're seeing these physical, that's where we're talking childhood sexual abuse, we're talking rape, we're talking assaults against one another, so the actual physical violence or verbal violence between two people or more. And then we have historical violence, right? So this is slavery. This is, actually, I think I have it. There we go. So the interpersonal, historical, looking at slavery, genocide of indigenous people, the Holocaust, all these things that really influence where we're at today. They all come up, it's cumulative. And so these things are always there. This is white supremacy. This is patriarchy. This is heterosexism. This is classism that are embedded in how we move through this world, and how the reasons we know why commercial sexual exploitation exists, right? It's because these systems are in place and alive. And then cultural trauma. And so I think this is kind of what we're experiencing right now when we look around and we know that the planet is in a state, and there's terrorism, there's war, there's natural disasters, there's chronic stresses, the chronic stress of racism and poverty. Those are all things that we all are carrying with us, and all of our participants, all the survivors, everyone who we're working with is carrying with us, and we have to acknowledge that pain and that suffering as we move through this world. Otherwise, what we do is we get stuck and we're just in this delusional process of pretending like everything's okay when it's really not. And we need to validate that, especially within folks in our programs, that this isn't easy, right? So I was talking about the brain. So when babies are developing, the brain is set up to survive. And so survival is the first thing it's trying to do. It's trying to get its food, trying to get its water, it's trying to stay safe. But in a traumatized brain, so this is with childhood sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, what ends up happening is in a healthy home, right, where everything's good and there's no fear and the kid is getting all the love and nurturing and food and care that they need, they're able to really focus on bigger things like cognition, social emotional regulation, all these things that help them move into adulthood, right, and help them manage the big emotions and the big feels that we have. But in a brain that's been traumatized, and especially one that has not just one instance of trauma, but multiple compounding daily, weekly, monthly, yearly instances of trauma, especially think about someone who's been, we know that survivors usually experience childhood sexual trauma as children, and then again, often there's rapes that go into their teen years. We see, if I'm looking at the standard, runaway, right? So we're talking the adolescent brain, and then the average entry into life we know is 12 to 14, right? So think about then the multiple times a day trauma that's being compounded and how that impacts the brain, because they're never able to focus on the social emotional regulation, the cognition. They're focusing on survival. And so those skills and that brain development, those neural pathways are not developed. And so, because it's focusing on survival. And so, what do we get with that? We get the behaviors, we get the life, we get the reactions, we get to what we get. And this is why people go to therapy. This is why I'm in therapy, right? Is because our brains need help to really create these different pathways. And so what we see, and what I've seen in the programs that I've run, is we see a lot of rage and physical violence, right? Verbal violence, substance use. These are all ways of coping with this trauma, right? Substance use is numbing out, not wanting to feel the pain that's so real. Rage, again, taking that power back. The world isn't giving these youth, these survivors, these people the power, so they're taking it. They're saying, no, I'm here, and you're going to see me in this moment. Theft, lying, distrust, again, wanting to take the power because the system has stripped that. You see self-harm, self-sabotage, negative self-worth, all these feelings. That's that self-directed violence that's constantly that internalized oppression that's constantly playing that narrative in their head, in our heads, that we aren't good enough, that we don't deserve to be here, that we don't deserve good things, that we don't deserve to be happy or healthy, right? And then oppositional behavior and moodiness, right? So these are the things that I've seen working in direct services for years, and the way that's typically done to manage, to deal with This is the traditional, right, punishment, consequence, kicking out. We get to NIU, that's how folks just get blown out of programs over and over. So I'm not going to do any questions because it's a bigger room, but think about in your programs or in your agencies or with the folks you're serving how these issues are coming up and how you see them playing out. And if you're in more of a policy organization, how does it play out with your staff? Because as we're going to talk about later, this isn't just, the distinction between participant, staff is gross. So we have to break down those barriers, we have to break down those hierarchies because that's what's maintaining these systems of power. So what I did some research on, I was stumped. I was in this organization and I finally got my own program. And I was like, okay, if I got my own program, I could call the shots, I could do this thing. And so I was running, like I said, this program for teens. It was an under 18 emergency shelter. So we were getting probably half our youth were runaway and homeless youth and half were foster youth who were coming in who didn't have placements. So we were, whenever someone didn't have a placement, they would come to us for a short-term stay until they found a more long-term placement. And so as we were doing this, we were implementing this and we had a lovely program. Everyone was down, everyone was working on themselves, everyone was addressing their internal biases. We were all talking and communicating and loving on each other as staff. We were trying to do that with youth. But there were still barriers because the agency as a whole, it was a larger agency, a social service agency, and we were one little program within it, and I didn't have control over the rest of it, right? All the administration, all the other stuff, the HR nonsense, all this, right? And so we were at odds, and we still had to follow these agency rules that really kept our participants subordinated and oppressed and homeless, frankly, because we had to follow these rules of exiting when two teens had a relationship with one another. Oh, surprise, that happens. They have sex. It's weird. And so we'd have to exit them from services. And so I started doing some research on this and on how trauma really gets replicated in programs. And so what we need to know is that there's a parallel process that's happening within programs. And that organizations are really living complex systems that are responding to internal and external trauma. So it's responding to the trauma. Our clients are coming in, our participants are coming in, and they're constantly in a state of hyperarousal and trauma because they're seeing this every single day. And so these external stressors are coming into our organizations, and they're met with providers who are then being pulled into that crisis instead of having the ability to stay outside of it and really respond to it in a way that promotes healing and growth. And so we see these agencies just doing this game of crisis management, running on that treadmill, and nothing's changing above. Nothing's changing in the system. And so we can't escape this. We can't break these cycles because the agency itself is getting pulled into these systemic oppressions, these systemic violences, and the interpersonal on the individual level, right? And so the parallel process develops. And so because the trauma in the interpersonal, and I also want to say that staff who go into direct service agency, they're often themselves impacted. So I went into social services because of my childhood, my life, and I thought that my whole fire was like, well, hopefully this happened for a reason. I can use this for something, right? And so that I think is a story of so many service providers and so many folks. There's a reason why we go into the work and do what we do. And so to pretend like staff in these agencies are not also impacted by trauma is, again, it's like we're sitting there at that Bird Box or whatever that show is with the blindfolds, like pretending like it's all good when it's not. Like it's crumbling around us. And so, so there's this trauma. And so then the organization itself goes into a state of hyperarousal. And that's a normalized state of crisis. Where the participants and staff are both responding to the causes of the systems of oppression that are around us and the interpersonal and generational trauma that's happened. And they stay in this state of hyperarousal. So again, we're just on this hamster wheel dealing with crisis after crisis after crisis, and we can't get out of it. So what ends up happening in these agencies is the same thing that happens in a person when they experience trauma. So they are in the state of hyperarousal. the agency is in a state of hyperarousal. They're constantly trying to deal with the next conflict, the next problem, the next emergency, right? How are we going to deal with that little thing there? What are going to happen when this micro, tiny, horrible thing happens, even though it happens every day? Let's plan for that again and again and again and again. We see an increase in bullying or silencing and dissent. So staff aren't getting along with one another. There's also a basic loss of safety and trust within organizations. So you can't trust one another. You don't trust admin. You don't trust your coworkers. And then there's blame because nothing's working and you're frustrated. And so you got your direct service providers pointing up and going, it's administration. They're doing it all wrong. If they would just fix this, then we would be okay. And you got the admin folks up top going, well, if those direct service providers would just do their jobs and get youth off the streets and, fix this, then we would all be good. And so you have this blame game happening where, again, we're just stuck in this loop. We're on the hamster wheel. We have a loss of emotional management. We have agencies that have high burnout where staff are just burning out. They can't there's no retention of staff because it's an unhealthy and it's a hopeless. It feels hopeless when you're in that. There's communication failure at every single level, right? So because we can't communicate openly with our participants because of and I'm not saying boundaries are horrible, there's a whole thing, there's a whole lot of good stuff about boundaries, but when you have to have this huge gap between you and the person in front of you who's in crisis, and you have to respond to them in a way that takes your heart out of it, it's not how we fix this. We have to connect. We have to. And then, in this book, Restoring Sanctuary, which is a great book that really talks about and breaks down this replicating trauma process, it says, as a result, these organizations are very tightly wrapped and tensions run high. Under such unrelenting stress, helping professionals and the agencies themselves become highly reactive and readily see threat rather than opportunity, pathology rather than strength, and risk rather than reward. So we constantly see liability or risk being taken into account when we're dealing with a person who's in crisis. And maybe they'll sue us if we, whatever, I don't know. Or again with children's administration, right? Maybe we're gonna lose our licensing because we're keeping two kids in program who have a crush on each other. And that we're seeing exits for that. We're seeing two kids get in a fight and we have to exit for that. Fighting is again, part of adolescence, right? But also a trauma response. So if we're acknowledging that our participants have trauma, we better acknowledge that they're gonna be fighting. And how are we gonna deal with that in a way that's not gonna further traumatize, right? So we're seeing at the institutional level, what that means is that there's lack of clear, consistent, and comprehensive theoretical model for how organizations are running. And this model is not communicated. In an ideal world, this model would be communicated at all levels of the organization. So it would be communicated to staff, to participants. Everyone knows what they're getting into. But instead, everyone's just running on that hamster wheel, dealing with the emergencies as they come. There's lack of safety in physical, emotional, and psychological safety within the organizations for both the participants and for the staff. And so they feel like they can't go to HR and talk about this because they could lose their job, right? Because we're in a capitalistic system, and so we have to have jobs to survive. And so they're stuck within this. There's communication failure and broken down feedback loops between staff and in the system. There's hierarchy in management, right? That's everywhere. And the structures encourage obedience to authority, but don't encourage innovative problem solving or direct conflict resolution. So what we get, again, is this brushing issues under the rug and not dealing with them, not looking at conflict head on, not acknowledging the trauma and hurt and pain that everyone's experiencing around us. And what that does is there's a relative ability to successfully address the enormity and the frequency, right? Again, so it's just the state of denial that these youth were just, or these folks, these participants, these survivors can just pull themselves up and get through this. And that's not true. We need to acknowledge that it's not true. That there's many systems in place, that white supremacy is in place, that patriarchy and capitalism are in place to keep this all down. And if we're not acknowledging that that's part of the reason that our participants, that survivors are seeing us in the first place, I think that we're denying and we're silencing their ability to grow. So, yeah. So how do we change these operating systems? How do we really move to a restorative model that acknowledges these systems of oppression and really says, how do we, in our day-to-day organizational structure, in our policies and our practices, from the micro to the macro, how do we address this in a way that really acknowledges the trauma that everyone is experiencing? And how do we combat that in every interaction that we have? So we need to remember that systems are alive. Systems of care organizations are alive. The structure is alive. And leaders must create programs and operating standards that apply to all participants, all community members. We at Option, I think we're trying to really shift this and talk about our community, instead of talking about staff and participants, is shifting to our community needs healing, right? And it could start at the organization level and it can blossom out from there. But it has to apply to everyone within the organization. We have to disrupt the rigid hierarchies because they maintain this scarcity mindset. They maintain that you can only do what's in your power control instead of everything that is within your ability, right? I imagine within our organization, if every single person could be their full selves and really show up every day without the limits of the hierarchy that's put on us. And I think that with that, we would all become our full selves, and that's the participants too. That's everyone, right? And so we have to really break down this idea that only those in power can be their full selves, can say what they want to say, can address conflict, because there's a risk if you address conflict, if you call out shenanigans, then you're going to get fired. You're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your life. And that threat is coercive in and of itself. And so if we're working with survivors and we're saying that, you should leave this situation, but then we are replicating those unhealthy situations and systems in our organizations, it's hypocritical. And we need to really embrace that. So really a model intervention must be easily understood and communicated. So it's really shifting to a values-based system. And so everyone needs to know your values. You have to out loud those values. You have to discuss those values. So this is hard, right? This means that we have to shift and we have to stop and we have to talk to everyone at every level. We need to come up together with what our values are and how we're going to move beyond just dealing and reacting, to really saying we move forward with respect, with integrity, with authenticity, with honesty, whatever your values are at your organization or at your workplace. And it needs to be adaptable to a variety of settings. So ideally what would happen is that these same set of values would apply at the larger organization level and it would apply at the individual level. So these things go for individual to individual as well as from top down. So everyone is adhering to this, and including the participants as well. It needs to be centered around empowerment of all organizational members. And it needs to stress the need for constant creativity and imagination. What we're doing right now, the template that we're acting within, is not working. Clearly, things aren't so good. So we need to flip that. We can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. We have to turn this around and we have to really shift this. And I just want to say that these are also principles, these are feminist principles, right? Of power sharing. And we need to flip it with the room full of mostly women. This is our way of doing it. So I think that we need to embrace that and say, like, okay, this other way of hierarchy and power and control and domination, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And so it's our time to say, in my everyday life, in my organization, from the top down, from the bottom up, we are shifting how we move through this world. We are focusing on community. We're focusing on loving one another, interpersonally and at the larger level. So, and this is for this to happen, it needs to happen in all different sectors, right? So healthcare providers, legal aid, everything. And in this book, it also says a shift in mental models is a critical first step in enabling the mental health systems and its allied social service systems to make effective contributions to the healing of traumatized children, adults, and families, and therefore contribute in a positive way to the overall health of the nation. We can't heal, our communities can't heal within an organization that's working in a state of hyperarousal, in a state of crisis, in a state of emergency. And it's only going to further their trauma response. They're not going to be able to get out of their crisis if we can't get out of ours. So we have to really model that at every level. So program containers, how you do this, right, at the individual level is really looking at what the space is and focusing on creating a different culture within that space. So safety, agency, dignity, and belonging are these core kind of things that we need to have within an organization, within a person, to feel safe and to move forward and heal. And so your organization or wherever you're at has to come up with these. What are your core values? What are you operating within? What guides every single decision, every single choice? That both participants maybe like look back at our values when someone's struggling with something and really go there. This is a big one. So I need to get water though. So this is the hard one because it requires us to do something. It requires us to look at ourselves. So this isn't looking at anyone else. This is not trying to blame. This is not trying to say the system's wrong. This is saying, hey, we are all living within oppressive systems. And we all have to do this adult self-work. And you have to start there. So if you haven't done that, if you're not doing work on yourself to heal yourself, start. And the ism work, right? So looking at your positionality, your privileges, the way you've been targeted, your identity, and taking ownership of those internalized biases. That's step one. That's like, you have to start there. So if you haven't looked at your own privilege, if you haven't looked at your own hurt and harm, your identities, and done that work to do some healing there, you gotta start there. And that requires a lot of work. And that's the piece of this that I think we're organized, it's hard, it's hard. And that's where conflict comes up, because as we start to work together and as we're honest with one another and as we're connecting with one another, we realize that we hurt each other on a daily basis if we aren't careful, if we aren't healing, if we aren't growing, if we aren't focused on our individual healing and growth path. So we have to do that. We have to step out of judgment, and thinking that we know what people are going through. We don't know what people are going through. We don't know their individual existence. And so we just need to be curious and move through the world with curiosity and trying to really understand where the other person is. I think that in social services there's a lot of assumptions that are made that they're just being manipulative. They're just trying to don't watch out, she's going to try and come get another gift card. She's going to try and get this. Of course she is. Of course she is. Because this world doesn't have enough stuff. It's full of stuff. And yet, no one has access to it, right? And so, yes, this is not like there's these things of like manipulation and pathologizing behaviors that are actually adaptive, right? That are actually useful. So we need to look at behaviors, we need to look at these things that when we look at something, we're like, ooh, that's not such a great trait, and I don't like it when you do that. And saying, like, how do we really shift that and say, what need are you trying to get met? What's behind this behavior? What's behind this action? What's behind this response? And how can I help you enter into a space where you're feeling your full self, where you're feeling your strength and your power in a way that's going to move you towards your values and your goals? And we need to interact with each other like that on every level. Stepping into that trauma-informed lens, that's someone saying, okay, I see you're doing this and I don't like it. What does it come back to? And in my life, I do that maybe too much with people. But I always think about, like, okay, this is coming from a place of hurt. This is coming from a place of pain. This is coming from a place of insecurity, right? These are coming from damages. And so to combat those damages, we have to actually, what we want to do is run away from one another, right? and be like, no, I ain't gonna deal with that. But we have to come together, and we have to come and lean on one another. We need to depersonalize intense situations. So again, someone comes at you, they're super mad, they're yelling at you, like, whoa. And hopefully, if we're looking at this in a context of a social service agency, survivors come in and that's what's happening, right? And we have to sit there and we have to go, okay, that's not the state I'm in right now. I'm in this chill state because I've done my adult self-work, right? And I can maintain that right here. And we can help that woman really get through that intense emergency that she's seriously experiencing and come to a place of calm and logically move through it. But what ends up happening is social service providers jump into that space of crisis with her and just run on that hamster wheel with her. And that does no good. And so we have to really kind of maintain our spot. And that's the same thing with, as supervising folks when a staff member is in that state of crisis. And we just with our HR policies, what we're really trying to do is say, okay, when someone's in a state of crisis, how do we address that in a way that's actually healing? So when someone has a medical emergency, guess what? It's a reason to pay them and keep supporting them and bring them flowers. Like, that's not a reason to say that their job is in jeopardy, right? I could go on with many different examples like that, but it's really, again, it's assuming best intention, it's assuming best. And there's danger in that, it's a scary thing. Do it. And identifying those feelings that don't serve you or the participant. So these are the red flag feelings. So with these come burnout and the inability to meet the needs of your community members, right? So impatience or exasperation, guilt and blame, not wanting to do something because it's too much work. I heard that a lot. It's like, well, that's not my job. I'm like, well, we're here to care for young people, so you're here, so do the caring. It is your job. So it's holding that accountability too. Anger, annoyance, irritability, frustration, feeling out of control and needing to gain control. Those are all red flag feelings, and when we're feeling those, we have to sit, stop, and think. Why am I feeling these feelings? Where is it coming from? What need is not being met for me? What do I need to ask for, right? That's hard work. That's years of therapy, right? That's like really emotional intelligence. And so we have to get there as individuals, again, before we're going to sit and talk about healing. And I think the programs that I've seen that really are successful do this. They really acknowledge that when I'm in this place of exasperation or frustration, I need to stop. And that's not the time to interact with anyone else. You stop it. I have a 5-year-old and I say, go to your calm down tent. Like, if he's frustrated, he's angry, he's doing this, you go be alone for a second. So do you need me to help you get through that? No? Okay, like, take some space. And so this is these things of really recognizing when you need to take space. And there's, on the burnout levels, right, I think there's kind of two kinds of burnt out. There's one kind of burnt out that is someone who's working too much and they're working around the clock and they don't sleep right and they have constant insomnia and they care so damn much and they are having dreams about their participants and how they're gonna whatever, all these things happen, right? And that leads to, I think, physical burnout. That's where your health gets impacted, right? That's where we start seeing like someone being like, I just can't do it, collapsing, right? We usually see the emergency, like that happens in social services. Or you see the other end. You see the crunchy social worker. She's not fun. She needs to go. She's like, right, thinks that everything's bad, and you have that jadedness, you have that, there's no hope. You know, why do anything? And very much like consequent control, all these things. And so we have to recognize when we're having those things so we can really come out of it, because no one in that spot can help anyone. And that goes for any organization. If you're in a spot where you can't sit grounded and centered in your values and move forward with intention, then you need to assess why you're there and deal with it. So shifting from this restorative mindset. So a restorative mindset really describes how a person understands community and one's role within that community. The values and concepts that underlie this mindset, that relationships and trust are the center of that community. that without trust and relationships between one another, we don't have anything. Those are the key to healing. And that's, again, I want to emphasize again that that is for survivors and participants, and that is for staff, and that is for me and to you right now in this moment. And we should be acting this everywhere. And I think that this is my personal thing, but I think that there's too much division between like my professional self, my real self, and I think boundaries are important again, but we are just severing off pieces of ourselves to try to fit this broken system. And again, we have to push up against that, because that's not going to be how we see liberation in this world. All members of the community are responsible to and for each other. So there's the accountability piece, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second, but it's I'm responsible for myself, and I'm also responsible for my community member. So if my community member is struggling, I need to recognize that, I need to name that, and I need to ask how I can help if I'm in a place to help or aid or do anything, right? There always are multiple perspectives that are welcomed, and all voices are equally important. So we need to recognize that there is diversity in thought, that everyone has unique experiences, that everyone is bringing their unique traumas to this, that there are triggers and there are ways of thinking that people have come to because of their life experiences, and they're not going to match ours. And so we really need to name that. And we need to be okay with that and be okay with different perspectives. And I think it's a very white way of moving through this world to think that conflict doesn't happen. It does, and we need to embrace conflict as a growth and learning opportunity to really get to know someone and move through that. Healing is a process essential to restoring this community, so everything needs to be based on how we can heal more and resource out. Harm doers should be held accountable for and take an active role in repairing that harm. And so it's not labeling someone as good or bad or anything like that. It's saying like there was harm done to this community, and how can that person be held accountable in a loving way that aligns with our values to repair that harm. Conflict is resolved through honest dialogue and collaboration. Problem solving that addresses the root causes and seeks to meet the needs of those involved. So if there's a conflict, there's a problem, we're going, okay, what is the root of this? What is the underlying issue? Because it's operating on this assumption that you're a good person and I care about you, and you just maybe don't have the tools, or you haven't practiced this enough to really operate in community in this healthy way. But we are going to always strive towards that. And so we have to have these honest dialogues where we're coming together and we're trying to see one another and address these things so that we can heal. So then there's the accountability to program values. So this is what we've talked about. This is between staff, right? So this is consistency. So that also what I've seen in programs is that there's these rules, and then one staff is really lenient and one staff is really strict, and so they pick their favorites and they put them against each other. It's like, go ask mom, or and then they go the dad, mom. They put it, what I'm talking about, like they put each other against each other, staff splitting, all that. So there needs to be consistency. There needs to be alignment. And that's where that talking and dealing with conflict comes in, because you have to get consistent. You have to really figure out how to work together so that there's not rules that don't make sense to one person. You have to make it so that everyone agrees, and that's hard work. It takes a lot of time. It's not easy. So that's where this is frustrating, because we can't move as quickly because we're coming up with a different template for how to move through this. We have to be able to head into uncomfortable situations and start getting comfy with discomfort. We have to embrace it, that this is going to be hard and uncomfortable, because when you're a white woman like I am, and you're dealing with addressing your own internalized racism, that's hard. Those are hard pills to swallow, but we have to address those things. If you're a man and you're addressing your own internalized misogyny, you have to address those things. And then just agreeing again to hold on to those values. Staff with participants. Are we seeing their whole person? Are we really addressing those behaviors with a restorative trauma-informed mindset? So this is participants to staff, it's all the same. And then youth to youth, so this is, or staff to participant to participant. So this is using the restorative justice tactics, and we're going to go into the details of that. And then again, I wanted to say that this is intensely hard. It's not easy work. And it's continuously doing that self-work with ourselves and the skill building and the growth work with participants. So we have to actually come up, what we've run into at OPS is that there's not a template for how to do this. And so we're creating it. We're building the freaking plane as we fly it. Is that how you say it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's really hard, because you're dealing with these conflicts and things when you don't actually have all the values in place. And when you do that, it's really hard. So I just want to really acknowledge that this is uncomfortable and that it requires really looking within and doing a lot of work within the community to skill build and resource. So there's types of restorative. So restorative circles are one of the tools to help skill build. And so there's a lot of research that's been done on restoration in communities. Okay. And yeah, so this is how you do community circles. So to actually do this in a healthy way, you have to do the community side of it. So you're getting together, this is staff meetings. This is staff meetings, okay? This is the everyday rituals that come with running a program. So these are community groups, right? And you're developing those relationships. So that's the first step, is develop those relationships, and then you're dealing with conflict after that. There's peace and accountability circles when there's conflict. There's justice circles, so it's calling out the harm done and making amends to that harm. And then there's theme circles. So OPS focuses on groups. We have a lot of groups that we run. And they are about communication, and we have survivor support groups, and so they're themed circles that really focus on the healing aspects of this work. They need to be consistently employed, and also the justice circles and the peace circles. So these things that are dealing with conflict can't happen until you have your community established. So you have to have the values piece of it, and you have to have a constant community that's created within a program or an organization in order for you to be able to do the conflict resolution work that needs to happen after that. And the thing with the community circles is it actually prevents the harm, and it prevents the instances. And when we did this at the shelter that I worked at, we saw the behaviors improving. We saw the community come together, the youth. There wasn't as much fighting. There's not enough name call. There's not the name calling. There's not the theft. There's not the running. It reduces running. It reduces all these things because you actually care about the place you're in and the people around you. And so you don't want to fight with them when you care about them. It's weird. Or when you're close up and you see their heart. I'm going to skip that. So punitive, restorative. I'm going to skip a lot of this actually. Yeah, so this is woo-woo and this is fluffy, I know. And so we really have to embrace both sides of it. That there's a level of, I think that a lot of people, when they think of this and they think of trauma-informed programming, they think of it as there's no rules. You're getting rid of all the structure, you're getting rid of all the, because what ends up happening is we're used to punishment, right? We're used to consequences. And so when you take that out of the equation, people are like, well, what do you do? And then you just get chaos, right? So you still have structure in there. You do. It's just about when there's harm done, you're actually holding accountable. And so you're either doing a restorative holding accountable. So let me think of an example. So one of the youth runs away. So we had a problem with running in our programs, and usually they would get exited for that, which is weird. So one of the things when I first started the shelter, I was like, we will not be exiting anyone for running. That's silly. Teenagers run. They do that. And they're not actually running. They weren't running. What they're doing is they're going to a party. They weren't running. And I look back and I'm like, who in here didn't sneak out their bedroom window to go? That's a really normal teenage thing. But because they're oppressed and they're in a shelter, right? That's not okay, they can't be normal teenagers. So they would run and then they'd be exited. That was the common thing. Like literally they would, the common practice is a youth runs, they come back to the place and the staff calls from their little phone and they say, sorry, you ran, you've been exited, you lost your bed, we will call the police and then you come pick you up. That's how it's done in shelters. So I said, that's wrong, we aren't gonna do that. And so we would have them come in and so they would run and guess what, they came back and we didn't have youth who went missing. It was weird. They actually, if they knew they could come back, they came back. And then we'd say like, hey, you scared us. We didn't know where you were. And we would actually have a conversation about it, right? And we would say we had to do these things where we'd have to call CPS, right, when someone ran because that's the rules. So we didn't know where they were. And so we'd have to have them, we'd have to call the police and do all these things, and that was a lot of work. So we would have the youth call and cancel their run. So we made them sit on the phone with CPS for a half hour, waiting on hold to cancel their own run. and they didn't like that. So they stopped doing it, and instead they'd say, hey, I'm going to go to the library from this time to this time. And we go, okay, be back by this time. And then they do it, right? So they tell us what they're going to run instead of just running, basically. And we'd say, just tell us, right? And we give them the minimum requirements so that we don't have to call this stupid run because it's a pain in the butt for everyone. The police have to come out. It's a big tax on the system, right? So we would have them, they'd have to call the police, they'd have to call the National Hotline for Missing and Exploited, they'd have to call and to do all this stuff. And so that's the restorative piece, right? Saying you caused harm. This is the time that staff had to take to call your run in, so now you're going to cancel it off. Don't do it again, please. And that's all it takes. Not really, it's really a lot harder than that, but that's what it takes. Yeah, so we don't want to be a prison, we don't want to be between rigid and strict and passive and loose. So they should be teaching positive coping skills and a healthy way of moving through the world. Value equity as a foundation, that's really key. Positively responding to these things in a way that's, again, not labeling someone as good or bad. We want to avoid emotional attachment that gives preferential treatment to dominant groups. So what we see happening again in most services is that the white kids all do better. Especially the white kids who come from more wealthy families. Those are the kids who do fine in our programs because they know how to play the game, the white kid. So this is what we have to do is we have to acknowledge when that's happening, when we're seeing certain groups be successful in programs and certain groups of people not. And we have to identify why that's happening. And we have to address the emotional attachment and treatment that's given to dominant groups. We have to avoid power struggles, those are silly. And punishment just for the sake of maintaining power, control, and domination over a community member. And what happens with this is we see a lot of improvements, and there's been a lot of research, and this is being employed in schools, and this is being employed in other social service programs, and we see an improved climate, increased connectedness, greater community engagement, increased program outcomes. And I believe that we're starting to really do this at OPS, and it's hard, and we're struggling, and we have to really stop, and we're having to recreate the wheel. It's weird, it's a lot of work. But I believe that once we are already doing it with our participants. This has been the model of care that OPS has done with participants for as long as it's been, and so what we're really trying to do is saying, we bring it all the way up to the organization, and we do that with staff, and we take down these power imbalances. Yeah. So that's what we're really trying to do, and I think that once we really acknowledge that, and because at OPS, it's I think everyone on staff, mostly it's survivors, but everyone on staff has experienced pretty complex trauma, and so we're acknowledging that we're not just moving forward with our blinders on. So that's that. Though Lisa's going to talk a little bit about the survivor-centered business stuff.
Yeah, so the entirety of the ops office had the flu essentially for the last week and a half. So we all have super, super hot voices right now. I can hear myself, which is telling me are you kidding? So how does all of this kind of we're talking right now, oh, it's right on my screen. Hi, I don't even need to move. We're talking a lot about this concept of what does this look like in a programmatic element? a lot of us within the movement, specifically with survivors, were very encouraged to go out and do work kind of in the larger national movement. And we see a lot of these power structures play out in instances over and over and over again. So if you were in my lateral oppression workshop yesterday, there's a reason I chose that workshop to do for this specific conference, because I know there are always a lot of survivors in the room. Some of them who have taken my programs before for the Lens series, which talks a lot about breaking down these barriers in between survivors. But what I want to really do right now is kind of talk to you as a survivor who's done some work in the movement for about the last 6 years. And again, you know, there was a moment when I was sitting on the panel with Audrey and Benita, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, I've been telling my story longer than I was in the life. That's weird. And it was starting to realize like exactly how impacted being in this, you know, how impacted I am just walking through this movement as a survivor, and how a lot of times these power dynamics that Angelia is talking about are playing out on kind of a larger, almost subconscious level. Like, I would just say that a lot of allies don't realize they're engaging in these behaviors. A lot of survivor leaders do not realize that we're doing these behaviors, and we're kind of reenacting the same systems. I always like to say that the movement can sometimes just feel like another version of a life. Like, we're still playing out our same traumas over and over and over again. You know, when I was in the life, there was a lot of lateral oppression going on between survivors. It's not the same, again, you know, prostitution, commercial sexual exploitation looks different depending upon when and where you are. But the reality is we see a lot of these same kind of instances of behavioral, basically implicate, obviously I need coffee or I've had too much. I can't decide which, probably not enough. But the reality is we're basically replaying out the exact same traumas that we went through already, and all we're doing is reenacting them on each other. And it's creating all these issues. And sometimes what I'm noticing is that there's a lot of things within the kind of larger movement that contribute to the perpetuation of these systemic oppressions. So again, I don't really like the terminology of survivor-led. It kind of just like intones that there's some sort of natural hierarchy between women. And we need to break down those barriers between women to actually get stuff done. Because when you look through the ideals of feminist history, when was it that we were doing the most work? And that was when we were breaking down barriers with one another and collaborating with one another and saying, yeah, we actually really just need to work together right now, because you, my sister, are not my enemy, but this thing up here that we like to call capitalism is really kind of creating some problems. And capitalism plays out within the larger movement. So a lot of the times when I hear that terminology of survivor-led or informed, survivor-informed, I love that. It's like survivor-led light. What's happening is it's actually translating. It's kind of like translating over to like survivor-consulted. And anybody who knows me right now knows that I'm utterly struggling with this podium because I love to walk around and I'm like, okay, does it move? So sorry if I'm a little fidgety. But it translates to this kind of like one-off survivor, or the closest survivor to you. One of the first things that I realized was extremely problematic about Demand Abolition's larger CEASE network, and don't get me wrong, they did some amazing work, and they brought some fabulous survivors together who I will call my mothers and sisters for the rest of my life. But one of the things that they did was they put in their grant RFPs, they said, you have to have a survivor on your core team. And that's where they left it. Which meant that some of these places that were applying for these grants were like out in the middle of nowhere. And they would literally be like, oh, she's a survivor, she'll come on and do this work, right? And that was it. There was no concept of like, how are we gonna walk alongside this survivor as she goes through this movement? And that's what I see with a lot of the kind of, I don't know what we call them now, younger than me survivors who are coming into this movement right now. There's no one walking alongside them to help them work through some of these things that Angelia is talking about as they're walking into this movement. And specifically with the fact that we look at how allies in general, kind of this larger group, not you all in this room are amazing, but this kind of larger understanding of like, oh, you are a survivor, therefore you will speak or you will do direct service and none between shall meet. And that's problematic because that creates division amongst us. So again, what I'm noticing is that the survivor-led kind of informed movement, it kind of ignores and promotes this lateral oppression through those concepts. And a lot of that is the fact that there is a lot of limited resources within this community. I'm not going to say that, oh yes, we're all like, there's no money in there. I'm not truly believing that. I don't want to be in that level of ideological of scarcity. However, what I did notice is there are a lot of limited positions for survivors in this movement that are not speaking or direct service. And that creates problems because you're not giving opportunities for growth. You're not saying, well, maybe I mean, I always say this, I suck at direct service. Do not put me in a room where there's a support group going on. It will be frightening. I will end up crying, sitting on the floor in a circle going, I really just don't know what we're doing, and I can't help you, and I really just hate all this. Give me a policy paper, and I'm going to write the nonsense out of that stuff. Give me a grant. I love writing grants. I am one of those weird people that actually likes bullet point lists. Check. Done. It's amazing. So the reality is that's not where my skill set is, but survivor-led movements, survivor-informed movements have a tendency of thinking those are the only things that we can do. And the reality is, you know, what do you do for fun? I do whatever you do for fun because I'm human too. And that means I have a whole self. And a lot of the times what I'm noticing is that it will pigeonhole survivors, like I'm saying. So a survivor-centered movement, which is the terminology I really want to move us towards, it kind of acknowledges the power and privilege imbalance between allies and survivors. The reality is most survivors that I know didn't have that opportunity to take that unpaid internship to maybe get the executive director job at that agency. Which means maybe we don't have as much professional, educational experience. But I'm going to tell you, we damn well have the lived experience. We got that. We got that covered. One of the other things that I'm noticing is that there's a lot of, as I said yesterday, this kind of W-2s, very few 1099s, which means that this isn't sustainable. Like, that is not a sustainable way to live. Unless you are like you've worked in this movement for hundreds and hundreds of years and you're doing amazing and you've got all these amazing little contracts lined up and you're good, which is generally something that happens to allies, not survivors. We're living paycheck to paycheck or literally contract to contract. And when some contracts, when you're kind of starting out as like a newbie survivor, as it were, or as I like to say, again, younger than me, survivor, then what is ending up happening is you're going, okay, well, I'll take anything that comes my way. I will take anything because that's going to show them that I am dedicated to this work and I know what I'm doing and I can do it. Which means some contracts are going to pay you $35 and some are going to pay you $2,500. And you're expected to pay your electricity bill with both. That just doesn't work. We also need to kind of understand this idea of what is equality, what is equity, and what is liberation. I truly believe in liberation, and I believe that equity is something that we need to be focusing on within a survivor-centered movement. And to do that, we need to focus on the power imbalances that are naturally in place and all of these historic and systemic oppressions that are in place that survivors are facing, that women of color are facing, that women who identify differently than I do are facing. Basically, women who don't look like me. Why are there not more of them on these stands and podiums? We need to actually push them forward. We also need to, again, acknowledge the lateral oppression. Like, we actually need to look at it. I mean, as I said yesterday in that, in that workshop was, I do not have the answers. I do not have the answers to lateral oppression. I don't. We need to come up with those answers together. And if that means that, like, who knows, maybe once a month, a local group of survivors need to get together and have conversations about what they're seeing and how we can, like, actually address them, that would be amazing. I'd like to see that on a national level. It flattens out the hierarchy, and truthfully, we need to start celebrating the diversity that we experience. Prostitution looks different depending upon where and when you exist. Prostitution looked different when I was in it over a decade ago as it does now in Seattle. as it does differently in India, as it does differently in Boston, as it does differently in Omaha. These are different places, and we've all had different experiences, and we need to acknowledge that the diversity of our voice is what gives us power. We also need to acknowledge that certain things are happening, and I think we're kind of perpetuating them without even knowing it. You know, I get a lot of these like, oh, Lisa, I listened to your talk about survivor-centeredness, but I still have to do this thing because the funder is requiring it. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe we need to have these conversations with our funders. Because that's always what I'm noticing is when I come to these conferences and I have these talks, there's a lot of direct service workers in the room, there's a lot of law enforcement in the room, a lot of legal agencies in the room, a lot of survivors in the room, not a lot of funders. And I think we actually need to start acknowledging that, because those are the people that are deciding where our resources are going. And our resources are continually going to the same places over and over and over again. And when we think about the limited resources that we have, I'm a federal grant reviewer. I talked about this in my workshop yesterday. And what I've noticed is that I continually am forced to score survivor-led agencies that apply for grants low. Why is that? Are they terrible programs that can't do anything and we don't know what to do with ourselves? Absolutely not. Ask a survivor how to get out of life and she's going to tell you. We know what we're talking about. Problem is, though, maybe we can't afford the best grant writers in the world, because we're trying a different model that nobody wants to fund. Or maybe we're in Omaha, or Dayton, Ohio, or, well, I'm sure Dayton's actually a pretty large place. I've actually never been there. I don't really go to that central portion of the country. I kind of just fly over it and go, hi! I literally did not know what to do with myself when I was in Montana. I'm like, there's a lot of space. What do you mean you can just see? That's like a straight line. If you've ever been to Seattle, we're very cushioned in this nice little, there's Rockies and there's mountains and that's pretty, anyways. But the reality is the same places are getting funded over and over and over again because we can't afford the better grant writer. That's crap. That is utter crap. And we need to do something to actually change that, which means we need to actually be having meaningful conversations with the people that are funding us and telling them and talking to them about how they are actually perpetuating systems of oppression that we are forced to work within, and that in turn will impact the people that we are serving. And that's not okay. So we need to talk about the ideas of long-term sustainable living wages and jobs with opportunities for growth and advancement for survivors. We need to not just be thinking about these as things that the allies can do and we don't know how to do. We need these things. I don't have a 401k. This is the first time I've ever been able to pay all my bills. I actually had a little bit of money left over after this last paycheck, and I was like, oh my God, we're going to Disneyland. No, actually I went to the aquarium, which was also extremely expensive, by the way. Very nice. Our aquarium in Seattle is amazing. You should totally check it out. We need to be mentoring as peers. We need to be thinking long-term. We need to be thinking outside the box. We need to be providing meaningful opportunities to learn. And actually, I'm going to add one thing in here, is that there's a term that I've been using lately, and I'm actually kind of ready to start embodying this idea. We need to start cultivating leadership through succession. What I've noticed is that when we have a survivor-led agency, a lot of the times what will happen is this kind of cult of personality up at the top, which is great, don't get me wrong, I love my sisters. But then when we decide to retire or leave or go do something else or maybe go back to school or change, say I'm really done with all of this movement nonsense, I'm going to go be an accountant, which I'm not going to do, by the way. That would be a really bad idea. But the reality is when we leave, those organizations crumble. And we need to start thinking about the future of this movement. Because I can't do this forever. I don't want to do this forever. I really don't. I love ops with a passion. It was the first place I found a support group. It was the first time I had ever said, holy shit, this has happened to other women. Other women have experienced this like me, and that's freaking amazing. It was the first time I started healing. That place will always, always have my loyalty above any organization out there. But I can only grow so much within that organization, and I need to learn more, and I want to learn more, which means I need to start bringing women alongside me so that they can figure out how I do what I do, and how Angelique does what she does. and how everyone else in our organization, we have a very awesomely diverse staff, especially like within height. Like it's kind of insane. Like we have like literally a 7-foot woman who's just like, you are really tall. And they eventually, and it's like, hi. But the reality is we need to start bringing women alongside us. Because truthfully, in 5 years, I want to be doing something different. I want to live somewhere else. Maybe in 2 years or 3 years or something like that. But in order for the organization to survive past this cult of personality, because this is pretty awesome. Right up here, it's pretty awesome. So is Noelle, obviously, says Angelique. But the reality is if I don't start bringing women alongside me, that's not going to happen, and it won't survive. And I want this movement to survive. I want this movement to be here long after I'm gone, even though I hope it doesn't have to be. So I think there's some key takeaways that I noticed when I was like randomly clicking through the slides. Coffee.
Yeah, I think that the key takeaways are, I think Elise actually really summed it up. So we just have to focus on the community, we have to focus on this movement, we have to focus on each other. And that only within focusing on community and getting back to this collective mindset, getting away from an individual mindset, that's the only way we're going to liberate one another and ourselves. And just recognizing that trauma is pervasive, and that it's not just interpersonal, that it's happening all around us, and we have to recognize that trauma that's happening and really acknowledge it so that we can move through it within our organizations. And that it's hard work, that this isn't easy, that we're really like, if you're doing this, it's an employing these within your organization, it's revolutionary. It will change things. And if we start it, if each one of you took a little bit back and said, like, how can we really start to break down those hierarchies within our organization, open those lines of communication, really start to get to know one another and hold each other's hearts as beautiful, whole things that we want to liberate. That's how we're going to really change this world and empower survivors and ourselves. So, yeah.
So we got like 5 minutes if there are, I think we have 5 minutes. Shay, Sarah, 5 minutes, correct? Hi. 5 minutes? Okay, cool. Yeah, are there any questions? Yes. And then Kathleen, you're definitely next.
I don't know if there's a mic, but I'll try to speak loud.
Sorry, probably
not. You talked
not.
about the community circles, and that was really interesting. Could you describe a little bit more about how that works, how often you do it, what you do in a community circle?
Yeah. There's a lot of different ways to do community circles. So in a really quick way, if you YouTube it, there's really some good stuff on Restorative Circles, and there's a really good YouTube video about what that looks like, and it's using in the school setting. So, but we do it at staff meetings. So what they do look like is, there's actually a slide on it. So these circles look like this. Usually there's a pre-circle. It's very structured every single time. It looks at your values every single time, and you're doing it on a regular basis. So you're reminding of the values. And it has a flow, there's a closing at everyone. So there's a level of consistency that happens with the circles. There's appreciations that are happening with it. So you're always honoring every member of the community at every single circle and getting to know a little bit where they're at in that moment and who they are as a person. So, and then there's guidelines and rules against, there's the values and then there's the guidelines. So I definitely did skim over this, but there's a lot of great resources online, and I can give you resources if anyone's interested. Come talk to me, I can email you stuff.
Kathleen?
Yeah, I was just wondering, because I know that programs, we all have different people, different personalities, difficult mindsets, difficult staff members. So I know where I had worked, we did have staff members that were difficult to get along. How do you handle that kind of stuff amongst each other? How do you feel that? How do you make everything be okay?
Well, I think one of the, I like to talk about this because the reality is I am a whole person, and I wake up in the morning and I drive 30 minutes to get to work, and I drive on one of this great, really, it's like the Autobahn where I was driving, which means that I get to work and I'm like, which means sometimes I'm like really in a crap mood and nobody has any idea why. And one of the first things that I can do to kind of start breaking that down is just learning how to be open and honest with my colleagues. One of the other things though is the reality is that we are whole humans which means we have whole personalities. And it means that I don't always get along. It means that I like chess and somebody else likes checkers, and well, how are we going to reconcile those things? Well, there's always kind of some way you can find those commonalities. I think a lot of the times we focus on how we're different and not how we can have some overlap and where we can find that overlap to meet between. Reality is not, you're not going to like everyone. You're not. That's like a really unrealistic thing. And yes, there are absolutely difficult people out there. I think Angeli, I always say, Angeli can see the bright side of a plague. So she can see the nice part of anybody, which I do not have that skill, but it's something I want to try and lean into more for her. So again, like this is a growth. We do not have a template for how to run an agency like this, and we're kind of still testing that out, figuring it out. And that's kind of the fun part. It's the stressful part, but it's also the fun part. So I'll let you know in a year. Yeah.
I loved how you talked about your gotten rid of the director role. How then do you do decision making?
Well, we have first thing we do is a tier system. So whenever we are confronted or kind of see some sort of decision that needs to be happening, we decide, okay, is this a tier 1 thing? So should I be making this decision on my own? Is it a tier 2 thing? Do I need one or more of my co-directors to make a well-informed decision about this thing? Or need like who has the check signing ability? Okay, well I need Angeli over here to actually physically make this thing move forward. This impacts the entire organization versus maybe this is just the thing that I'm dealing with right now. It's literally kind of figuring out like the difference between, are the yellow napkins important? Are the blue napkins important? And realizing that, yes, you can make that decision on your own. So you still have that kind of autonomy, but at the same time, it's acknowledging that those decisions will impact a larger organization, and you kind of need to feel out that Venn diagram. So yeah, and then we have the tier 3, which is like all hands on deck. We need to all talk about this as a group. Doesn't mean it always works. We can usually identify where things are. Sometimes we disagree on that identification, and that's usually a point where you have to kind of bring everybody together to have a conversation.
And I just want to add that I think that with the conflict and with this both, like there's not a lot of templates out there, so we are creating it, right? But I think the biggest thing is if someone, let's say there is a conflict and someone's in your community who it doesn't fit, it's not working well, then I think that we could still wholeheartedly move forward and lean into that and say, hey, it looks like you're unhappy here and it's not jiving. How can we support you to get somewhere where you're going to be happier? And that might look like they join a different organization or we help them do whatever it might be that they need to do, right? And it doesn't mean that we have to fire them, right? That's not what it can look like. It can look like I've fired many people, but I didn't fire them at my other jobs. It was talking about like, you're really anxious here. It doesn't seem like you're happy, and I'm not saying you do the best work, and I think you would really strive in this setting, which leads to your strengths. This is not your strength. And that's honesty, and that's accountability. And so I think it's okay to hold someone accountable, and it's okay to say, like, this isn't the right place right now. So I think it's just talking about that, and that's with decision making. It's the same thing. It's talking about how you do it and what you do and the tiers and everything.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.